Our story is one of neighbors.
I don't pretend that it's going to be easy.
Don't let your anger turn into hatred. We know that hatred is like a fire. When it's allowed to grow, it will consume everything.
Welcome to Orange Wave, the series discussing progressive news, culture, and all things related to the NDP. I am your host, Will Adams, and the Conservatives have a shocking problem right now when it comes to their conduct and their abilities to be in touch with Canadians. Take, for example, the time Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, ended up making a national embarrassment of herself by enabling Tucker Carlson's weird rhetoric. And I do mean really weird. But don't take my word for it. Take his word for it.
I know that in Canada it's official policy that coming out of the closet is good. Unless you're the Prime Minister. Unleashed in Canada! They literally say diversity is our strength before they open the game. Okay, what does that mean and why is it true? Shut up! No, I'm not gonna shut up. Shut up, racist! No, not going to. Not racist, I'm not gonna shut up. Message is, you are bad. I watched when Montreal was cleansed of its Anglo legacy. They're taking away your voting power by changing the population of your country, which they are doing, and no one wants to talk about that. Shut up, racist! That's not racist. Subsidizing the media to the point where all of your big media outlets, which are disgusting, are state media, should internalize the message of that, which is they hate me. They hate me to the point they're willing to kill me, which they are. You're serving someone other than the people of Canada, if you know what I mean. Hard-edged fascism, actually. And frankly, I'm a little bit more comfortable with the old-fashioned variety. Get rid of these people and everything will be okay. Yes, he's a girl. Sorry, she's a girl. She's a girl. Oh, you're gonna take my kids away because I don't want to castrate them. Shut up, racist!
You just heard racist and homophobic statements coming out of that man's mouth. He was fired from a mainstream player in the right-wing establishment media, that being Fox News, because his lies were too much of a liability even for them, and it was costing them so much money. Yeah, a supposedly serious elected official should not be wasting their time propping up a weird ass like Tucker Carlson. But hell, Danielle Smith was not the only high-profile guest Tucker had. Canada's very own Jordan Peterson came to Tucker's event, and he decided to needlessly shill Pierre Poilievre.
I'll tell you a quick story about Mr. Poilievre, a couple of sentences. I met him at the residence of the opposition, and I met his wife, who I thought was a very solid person. And one of the concerns they expressed to my wife and I while I was there was the expense that they had racked up at the expense of the Canadian taxpayer for moving them into Stornoway, into the residence. And I thought two things. I thought, all things considered, you probably have more important things to prioritize. But the fact that that actually bothers you and that was genuine and unprompted is a good sign, because I don't think that Pierre Poilievre thinks that your money is his.
Jordan Peterson conveniently left out the part that Pension Poilievre is one of the richest politicians in the entire country. He has never worked a real job a day in his life, and he gained controversy when he spent winter break last year on a rich friend's boat. And he didn't disclose whether or not an elite friend paid for the trip or if he used taxpayer dollars to pay for the trip. Some conservative politicians even pay rent to Pierre and his wife directly, as him and his wife own multiple properties. If Pension Poilievre actually cared about the cost of Stornoway, he'd refuse it and pay for his own place. But the fact that in his first year as CPC leader, he spent $119,000 more than the Prime Minister did the entire year in only 3 months. I'm not pulling this out of my ass either. It's on the Our Commons website. I'd recommend checking it out because Pierre's travel costs were just ridiculous, but I feel like that alone is a good indication that Pierre Poilievre in fact does not care about offsetting the cost of his living, his dental care, or his anything onto taxpayers. Okay, major ethics issues aside, the Tucker Carlson event is one example of many examples proving that the Conservative Party of Canada is having something of an identity crisis, and you can see it if you pay attention to it. Ever since 2003, the party has had problems. Stephen Harper was a global capitalist who sold out several industries to random countries, and he locked us into a FIPA deal in secret with China in the early 2010s. But back then they at least had some principles, and they had an actual goal. Was it a good goal? Not really, but it was a goal nonetheless. Nowadays, they are the most unprincipled party in Canadian politics. Pierre Poilievre does not take a principled stance on anything. He instead dodges questions and attacks journalists until he has decided what his supporters want to hear, then he comments. When he does take a principled stance on something, it's something that's stupid and something that he should not be wasting his time on. And even then, he will still attack journalists when they don't ask him softball questions, which just proves that Pierre loves democracy. If you separate Pierre Poilievre from the equation altogether, though, there is still so much wrong with this party. Today I'm bored, and this has been ticking in my internal clock for a while now, so I think it'd be worth taking a look at exactly why there is a big problem with the Conservatives, and why it'll ultimately harm them in the next election, why I think Poilievre is ultimately a liability for them in the long term, and what kind of lasting effects his agenda could have on the party. Their first problem is the most upfront and the most apparent: their conduct. The party seems to be forgetting their dinner table manners whenever they are interacting with people. The biggest example was what I mentioned earlier, with Poilievre attacking journalists for asking him questions.
A lot of people would say that you're simply taking a page out of the Donald Trump book.
Which people would say that? So I mean, we have basically a liberal heckler who snuck in here today to. The carbon tax was inserted by Justin Trudeau, not by my supporters. Why did he do that? No, but I'm just curious. Can you explain to me why there is a carbon tax in the agreement? No, I asked you a question. You keep asking about the agreement.
We're the journalists. We ask the question.
I have the freedom to ask questions if I want to, and I've just answered. I've been answering your questions all week.
Here's another one.
So no.
The government's introducing
why would they do a
investment
carbon
tax
tax?
credit.
You're not changing the subject. I know you want to change the subject.
No, I want to ask
because you don't want to talk about Trudeau's carbon tax.
The Globe and Mail shows your party has advised MPs not to comment publicly on Alberta's new transgender health and education policies. Why are you telling MPs not to comment on this? And can you please tell us your opinion on your party's position on increasing restrictions on transgender youth?
Sorry, what's that? What was the last part of your question?
Why are you telling MPs not to comment on this? And can you please tell us your opinion on your party's position on increasing restrictions on transgender youth?
Okay, well, your question contains falsehoods. You should to tell me what restrictions you're referring to. This is the problem. Justin Trudeau and the media have been spreading disinformation to distract from his doubling of housing costs, his quadrupling of the carbon tax, the crime wave that he's unleashed across the country. And they're doing that by spreading disinformation on this and other issues. Justin Trudeau does not want to defend his appalling record.
During the Harper administration as housing minister for Harper's government, Poilievre oversaw the government selling 800,000 affordable houses to private investors, many of whom do not actually live in country. Poilievre also voted in favor of outsourcing several Canadian industries, including but not limited to our wheat board to Saudi Arabia. Poilievre is also guilty of voting in favor of a FIPA deal with China that we are locked into for 31 years that is red flag city all around. Those are just two things he did during the Harper government. Is Pierre going to defend his record? No, he's not. Granted, it doesn't really matter. I know for certain that if any journalist asked him those two questions and called him out for being a hypocrite when it comes to things like housing and jobs, you know what Poilievre would do? He'd label them as a liberal heckler who's pushing the government's agenda. It doesn't even matter if the journalist in question is working for CBC or not. That's just the argument he has. And when all else fails, mental gymnastics, changing the subject, other thought-stopping techniques. And, despite all of that, in terms of Poilievre being crass and unprofessional, this is just scratching the surface. The most recent example where Poilievre is acting unprofessional is the situation where Poilievre called the Prime Minister a wacko in the House of Commons, and Speaker Greg Fergus requested Poilievre to rescind his comment, where this happened.
22 British Columbians have died of drug overdoses. But he continues to allow those drugs to kill the people in our hospitals and on our public transit. When will we put an end to this wacko policy by this wacko Prime Minister?
No. That is not there are a couple of things which are going on here today, which is not acceptable. And I ask all members, please, to keep themselves, to control themselves. I'm going to ask two things. One, I'm going to ask the Honourable Leader of the Opposition to withdraw that term, which is not considered parliamentary.
Mr. Speaker, I replace wacko with extremist. He is an
The Honourable Member to please. I'm going to ask the Leader of the Opposition once again to just withdraw that comment, please. And I'll invite the Honourable Member. I'm going to ask the Honourable Leader of the Opposition to please withdraw that comment and simply withdraw that comment.
I'll replace it with radical leftist policy.
I am not asking to replace. I'm asking the Honourable Member to just simply withdraw.
Mr. Speaker, I replace the word wacko with extremist.
I'm going to ask the Honourable Leader of the Opposition one last time to please withdraw that comment and simply withdraw that comment.
I simply withdraw and replace with the aforementioned adjective.
Mr. Poilievre, I have to name you for disregarding the authority of the chair. Pursuant to the authority granted to me by Standing Order 11, I order you to withdraw from the House and from any participation by video conference for the remainder of this day's sitting.
To say that this was a controversial choice would be an understatement. In fact, CTV News political analyst and former leader of the NDP, Tom McClare, referred to the situation as manifestly partisan, and he feels that this showcased liberal desperation.
Before you get to the point that Greg Fergus got to today, you've got to go through a heck of a lot of other steps. This was not only precipitous, for me it was manifestly, obviously partisan. And I don't come at that lightly. I remember when Greg Fergus got caught making a very partisan video, I was one of the people who defended him. I'd been a House leader in Ottawa. I was a deputy House leader both in power and in opposition in Quebec City, where it could be very rough and tumble. But I've never seen anything like this, Vashi. Never in my career have I seen such, in my view, blatant partisanship from a speaker. I think that he's disqualified himself from the position, and I am indeed one of the people who defended him. When people were calling for his head after that video, I said, it's a rookie mistake. Let him prove that he can be autonomous, independent, act, fairly with everyone. Today, he failed completely.
Respectfully, of course, Tom McClare has some biases of his own, mainly against Trudeau. It's basically his job to analyze stuff Trudeau does and pick it apart. I'd imagine that Tom McClare is actually rooting against Trudeau in the next election. I don't know who he's rooting for, but I guarantee he's rooting against Trudeau. That's his opinion for 2025. I know that much. As for what McClare actually said, I don't exactly agree with him. I don't think that this is an example of Greg Fergus being biased. For this to be a biased situation, Fergus would have had Trudeau do something similar and then overlook it completely. Then do this to Poilievre. Trudeau did not do something similar to what Poilievre did. And no, Trudeau pointing out the fact that Poilievre shakes hands with certain individuals does not count. Because that was not only something that factually happened, but Trudeau did not use unparliamentary terms when he addressed that. Poilievre, however, was asking Trudeau to exceed his authority as Prime Minister, to interfere with what the provinces do. And don't worry, we'll get to that later, but Not only was Poilievre doing that, but he was using unparliamentary terms while doing so. Before I circle back to the thing about media bias, let's look at another example. On November 29th, 2023, the Conservative MP for Lethbridge, Alberta, Rachel Thomas, was at a committee and she asked a question. A Liberal MP from Quebec answered the question in French, and Thomas not only started making demands for an answer in English, but she also went as far as to question why she received an answer in English.
Minister, I noticed that you answer my questions in French, but other English questions you answer in English if they're from your Liberal colleagues. I realize it's completely your choice. We're a bilingual country, but if at all possible, I'd love to have it.
Rappel au règlement,
Point of
Madame la
order,
Présidente.
yeah,
Rappel au
that's not
règlement, Madame la
appropriate.
Présidente.
Stop shouting. My observation was that the Liberal member was afforded the opportunity to be answered in English, and I was not afforded that same opportunity. I recognize that we're a bilingual country, and by all means you can answer in either language. I'm just curious if you would be willing to answer in English.
Point of order, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, point of order.
I have to go back to the original point in the point of order, and that is that the person speaking should choose what language they wish to speak in. And if the minister chooses French, fine. If she chooses English, fine. We cannot make her answer in whatever.
I think that the fact that the Conservative Party has demanded that a member speak only in English, to me is it goes against everything this country has been built on. You know, when we come into this chamber, we have two official languages that, you know, everyone's afforded. And the fact that the Conservative Party is demanding that a member only use one language, to me is just unacceptable.
What I find particularly reprehensible is the question as to why somebody has chosen to use a particular language. It's one thing to make the demand, it's another thing to ask the question why a minister chose to use a particular language. I mean, I think that this speaks to something very dangerous and very irresponsible on the part of the Conservatives. I think it would be valuable and important for Ms. Thomas to retract that question or to retract that assertion, because I think it is in the interest of all of us in this room that we not have to play silly games around the use of our official languages.
All right, to get back to the Peter.
Madam Chair, just for Mrs. Thomas's education, having been brought up in an English environment and having learned French in school, there are numerous times when you have a vocabulary in one particular language that allows you to speak more easily in that language. And that is the principle of official bilingualism. For the Conservatives to put in question official bilingualism is absolutely reprehensible.
The MPs who called Rachel Thomas out on this were absolutely correct. That kind of behavior is indefensible and embarrassing. The House of Commons and committees in Canada have translation tools in place for those who may not be able to understand one language or another, so there's zero excuse for stuff like this. What Rachel Thomas did was disrespectful to Francophones in Canada, and it showed a disregard for Canadian culture. Bloc leader Yves-Francois Blanchet called it out as disrespectful, which makes sense. MPs like Rachel Thomas are the exact reason the Bloc exists in the first place. I mentioned this on social media a little bit ago and got some responses that basically told me that the way she conducted herself was perfectly justified. So if I'm wrong here in some way, I'd love to hear in the comments what exactly it is about my observation that you disagree with. Because the fact that she gave a basic politician apology when she got heat for it tells me that she not only knows that it was unacceptable, but it indicates that she probably wouldn't have apologized if she didn't get caught. So on top of being disrespectful to Francophones, Lethbridge should probably reconsider who they vote for come 2025 because their MP doesn't have a spine to show some follow through on what she believes. Alright, so for the sake of it, I'll add one more. You know, just to round out everything and bring it all together. Back in December 2023, Conservative MP for Peterborough-Kawartha, Michelle Ferrari, decided that it would be a lovely idea to film a video of herself going into the men's room and going on an unhinged delusional rant about tampons. Yes, that is something an elected official in Canada did, and it was just, it was so painful.
Has been put in the bathrooms. That is period products for federally regulated employees. I can't stress enough to you how out of touch this is in a cost of living crisis when people who can't afford to eat, they can't afford to buy these things. But again, the Liberal NDP government is prioritizing their own needs over the people who are most vulnerable and hurt by their policies that is driving up the cost of living. This is not common sense. I hope you share this video. And you know what? I might just take a couple of these myself and walk them down to the Ottawa Food Bank where they would be best used, not here. Thank you.
So I'm no hockey fan, but if this was a match of hockey, she'd be in the penalty box right now because there is just so much wrong with this video. For a start, the least problematic thing, somehow, is the fact that this is a video of an elected official filming herself in a bathroom, going on a rant. Filming yourself and recording yourself in bathrooms is a misdemeanor. You get a fine for that. This is an elected official acting like that. This isn't a teenage girl. This is a grown-ass woman going into a bathroom and filming herself going on a rant. Then there's just the obvious fact that she's being transphobic. That's the only takeaway I can get from this, seeing as she's filming a video of herself outraged that, you know, trans men who work in the House of Commons are getting menstrual products provided to them. Oh, and after filming this video that, you know, if her colleagues got uncomfortable about, they could, you know, file a complaint about this being harassment, targeted harassment. She takes the menstrual products, but they're specifically because some staff members are using them. She takes them and talks about donating them to like a woman's shelter or something. You know, I'm not a woman, but I'd imagine it would be completely insulting for this other woman to tokenize me and use me as a political prop, all while simultaneously doing nothing to help make my situation better. And I say that because I know she's only been in Parliament for a couple of years now, but what has Michelle Ferrari voted in favor of that would make life for women in Canada easier? You know, she'll talk a big game about the carbon tax affecting single mothers, making them unable to afford stuff because yes, it's a very unfortunate reality. Many single mothers cannot afford life in Canada right now. But you know what Michelle Ferrari voted against? She voted against expanding universal health care in Canada. She voted against the expansion of publicly funded healthcare in Canada, dental and particularly universal pharmacare. And more notably, she voted against a publicly funded school food program that would make it so that way that single mother that she is commodifying, that single mother, her kids would not have to go hungry in school. And like on a more personal note, I know several trans men, and I certainly know that they have periods. This display was one of the most ridiculous and out of touch displays I think I've ever seen from an elected official in Canada. And I think she needs to resign after making this outrageously stupid video. Elected officials should not be acting like this. It's not a high school. You're elected to do a job for ridings. You should be doing them, not going into bathrooms and filming delusional rants, not attacking French Canadians, certainly not attacking journalists for asking you basic questions when you put yourself in a position to be questioned, when every single thing you say and do affects other people, not just your community, but ultimately speaking, the country at large. And you know, this reminds me of that little video where Tom Mulcair talked about bias in favor of the Liberals. You know what Tom Mulcair didn't mention? He didn't mention how the media is very biased in favor of the Conservatives. And everything I just mentioned is very much proof of that. Let's put it into perspective for a second. How would the right-wing establishment media act if Justin Trudeau filmed a video of himself going on an unhinged rant while recording himself walking into the women's room complaining about tampons? And I don't ask this in like a red team, blue team way. I ask it as in just separate your biases for a sec. Think about what the media headlines would be if Justin Trudeau acted that way. because I've been thinking about it for quite some time, and I know for certain that if Justin Trudeau did that, it would be the next big scandal. It would be the next Trudeau did blackface before he was elected thing. Actually, I think it would be worse than that. You would have people calling for his arrest. Despite the fact it's a misdemeanor, you would have people calling for his arrest. The Conservative Party would be posting about it on social media for weeks, at the very least. And come 2025, on the debate stage, it would be a talking point. You know, Justin Trudeau is filming himself going into the women's room and going on unhinged, out-of-touch rants. This is not how a leader acts. We need to have a conversation about that. Could you imagine what the reaction would be if a Liberal MP showed such a callous disregard for French-Canadian culture? I'll tell you what would happen. 2025, on the debate stage, Poilievre would be throwing Trudeau under the bus, talking about how Trudeau and his party has such a callous disregard for Canadian culture and how that's a conversation that needs to be had. How the leading political party should have a regard for Canadian culture. But you know something I noticed when the Conservatives did all this stuff? The media talked about it for a couple days. Just a couple. And then they completely acted like it didn't happen. Like they pretended it didn't happen. Issue 2. The amount of lying and misleading they do. Nobody likes being lied to. If it's someone you love, you feel betrayed. And if it's done out of spite to intentionally mislead you, then you just feel like your intelligence has been insulted. So when a political party does just that, you should feel just as, if not more insulted when they do it. Now, you already saw the clip where Poilievre claimed that Trudeau's policies were causing overdoses en masse. That was not even remotely accurate. Poilievre was referring to drug decriminalization in British Columbia. That is a provincial decision, not a federal decision, but he seems to believe that Trudeau's the one responsible for that, because Trudeau hasn't used the notwithstanding clause to make the decision that British Columbia can't do that. And we're going to touch on the notwithstanding clause later, but a big portion of Poilievre's strategy is ultimately to lie about stuff that Trudeau's responsible for, when Trudeau isn't responsible for province-to-province decisions. Ultimately to blame Trudeau for stuff his Conservative premiers have done. And for a good example of the Conservatives misleading people, we need to go no further than the riding that was held for 10 years by former Conservative Party leader Erin O'Toole. The by-election in Durham is something I directly participated in. I went around Bowmanville and Oshawa handing out flyers on behalf of Chris Borja, and in that effort, I got to have a very inspiring conversation with Jagmeet Singh. I also got to interview Chris, and we had a great conversation. I've also had some conversations with PPC candidate Patricia Conlon and independent candidate Pranay Gunty, who I unfortunately was not able to talk to in person. Robert Rock was the Liberal candidate. Only things to really take note of there are the fact that a business got harassed for hosting Rock and Trudeau, and of course Robert Rock ran for the Conservative candidacy before losing out and ultimately deciding to run Liberal, showcasing his lack of integrity in pursuit of political power. Moving on. Then of course, there was the Conservative candidate, now the MP for Durham, Jamil Javani. Before federal politics, Jamil Javani was a political commentator, just like me. On paper, of course. Jamil Javani was the head of the very conservative Canada Strong and Free network. Before that, he worked for Bell Media, until being fired under the grounds of alleged homophobia, transphobia, and anti-vaccine rhetoric being pushed on his shows. The transphobia from him directly, where he made the assertion that non-binary people use they/them pronouns purely for attention. And the anti-vaccine stuff was mainly him platforming the rhetoric of guests while not doing his job as a journalist to ask any counter questions or bring up any counterpoints. Now, Jamil Javani did mischaracterize all of what happened on a post he made to his Substack page, but that isn't even what we're talking about today. That was just background information for what Jamil had done before federal politics. But I think the fact that that is the example I was able to bring up while describing his life pre-politics, it really sets the stage for what we're actually going to talk about. Jamil Javani announced his candidacy to fill Erin O'Toole's vacant seat in April 2023. And despite the fact that Durham region is where I reside, now I personally did not know who Jamil Javani was pre-candidacy. When I first discovered him, reading up on him, I was thinking, okay, Canada Strong and Free Network, okay, what does that actually, what's your connection to Durham? He doesn't have a real connection to Durham. He didn't live here. He wasn't raised here. He doesn't live here. He lives in a part of Oshawa that isn't even in the Durham riding. Jamil Jivani is a parachute candidate. And I guess the majority of voters don't actually vote in by-elections because Jamil Jivani, although winning the seat in Durham, won with the lowest voter turnout in Durham's history. He did not actually get that many votes. Barely a third of Durham's voting population actually ended up voting in the first place. I discovered who Jamil Jivani was when he made a X/Twitter post in late January 2024, where he addressed something Trudeau said about him at a caucus retreat.
Justin Trudeau is talking about me today. Now, during a speech to his Liberal caucus, Trudeau referred to me as a twofer.
And now, Pierre Poilievre's new candidate in Durham is a twofer.
Now, I'm not exactly sure what that means in reference to a human being. I'm also not sure how the Prime Minister has time to be name-calling when he should be trying to save his failed administration. But I thought I would take this as an opportunity to introduce myself, since you certainly can't take Justin Trudeau's word for it.
With Poilievre's response to that video on social media, you were supposed to take this as Justin Trudeau calling Jamil a token, a minority the CPC will keep in the deck of cards for when they need a black man to agree with their agenda, but won't do anything to deal with racism, having an excuse not to because Jamil is black. Now, if Trudeau made that statement unprompted right out of the gate with no rhyme or reason, yes, absolutely, that would have been racist. But I'm sure you noticed that the video cuts out right away, almost a bit too fast. That is because there was a lot more to the statement that Jamil actually cut out of the video. JT immediately follows up with an explanation, referring to Jamil as an insider and an ideologue, and not someone with ties to the community he's running in.
But of course, it is telling that the Conservatives never leave room to air differences between their colleagues. They want to silence their caucus and give out orders from the top. And we take a look at the candidates brought in by Pierre Poilievre over the past number of by-elections to understand what kind of party he is really building. They've been either insiders or ideologues or both. The Conservative elected in Manitoba's recent by-election is openly anti-abortion and opposes the ban on conversion therapy. They welcomed Robin Baber as a candidate in the GTA, even though his extremism got him kicked out of Ontario's Conservative Party. Their new MP in Oxford was a hand-picked insider who'd never been to the riding. And now, Pierre Poilievre's new candidate in Durham is a twofer. He's both an ideologue and an insider. What he's not is someone who has lived and served in the community for years. This is a candidate who Poilievre expects will do his bidding in the riding, will be Ottawa's voice, Pierre Poilievre's voice, in Durham, instead of being Durham's voice in Ottawa.
So, in short, Trudeau meant 2 for 1, referring to Jamil's deep ties to Conservative politics, as well as his place as an influential political commentator. If Jamil Jivani was an honest person, he would have shown the full video in his tweet, to let people understand what JT actually meant. He would have offered a counter-argument to what Trudeau actually said, to let people decide for themselves what they think. But instead, he decides to mislead people right when the sprint to the finish started. Might I reiterate, if a Liberal candidate tried framing Poilievre as a racist in a manner that was not accurate, it would be all the right-wing establishment media would talk about for weeks. They would be going on about how it's liberal desperation, and I guarantee that Jamil Jivani would be front and center when that would happen. Oh, but don't ask them any honest questions about that, or else you're just a liberal heckler. Let's shift focus to Ontario. Back when Stephen Lecce was Ontario's Minister for Education, he was universally disliked. Parents, teachers, students, even Conservative voters, And all of that was for good reason. The most strikes and days of school missed in Ontario's history happened under Stephen Lechier's watch. He has left schools dangerously underfunded. There was a situation last year where an elementary school student cried for hours due to how hot her school was, due to the lack of proper ventilation, and in this case, the lack of air conditioning. The ventilation was a really big problem during the COVID-19 pandemic, which caused kids to miss out on class time. And some people are saying that that has left Gen Alpha developmentally stunted. All of this and more happened under Stephen Lechier's watch. As a student during that time, I definitely felt the damage. When Doug Ford shuffled his cabinet, Lechier was finally removed and is now serving as Ontario's Minister for Energy and Electrification, which, could mean rolling blackouts. But before his removal, he decided that the educational system has unconventional problems and that they needed to be fixed. So what did Lechier do in his greater wisdom? Oh, he reintroduced cursive into the younger grades. A font that nobody under the age of 70 uses in the real world anymore. Oh, but Stephen wasn't done there. No, he decided to put it on the priority list to and I quote, ban vaping and cell phones. Actually, I'll let him explain it.
Our policy on cell phones is quite simple. The default this September, unless explicitly directed by their educator, for a child is out of sight, out of mind when it comes to cell phones in Ontario.
So you heard it there, out of sight, out of mind. Starting this fall, students from kindergarten to grade 6 will be asked to keep their phones on silent and out of sight. And those in grades 7 to 12 will not be able to use their devices during class time. Any student caught breaking the rules will have their devices taken away, with repeat violations possibly leading to suspension. For more on the new measures, we are joined in studio this morning by Ontario's Minister of Education, Stephen Lechier. Good to have you here, Minister.
Good morning.
All right, let's start off with, this is a revision or an update from the 2019 ban. So one of the frustrations from that ban, at least what I heard from educators, was that there was not enough power for teachers to enforce the rules. They weren't allowed to take phones from students, which was the problem. This revised version appears to give more authority to teachers and to the schools if there's pushback from students or from parents or guardians. Can you outline the process for repeat offenders for us?
When we say out of sight, out of mind, it's really about reconditioning young people to learn in a way where they're listening to their educators, where they are focused on the curriculum. And we remove the impediments that have set back many kids. I mean, the fact that we still have half of Ontario students not meeting the provincial math standards is a reminder that we in government, in education, and in our communities and homes, we've got to do better. And we're bringing forth a Team Ontario approach. And so, yes, we've brought forth a policy that is different, that is provincial, that sets a standard, and that gives power back to the educator to teach and to enforce. At the core, this is an educational policy more than an enforcement policy. It's about changing the hearts and minds of young people to understand that there's a better way to learn. And that's why we are giving that authority. But at the core of this, it's about curriculum change. We're going to be mandating mandatory learning on responsible use of technology, on the perils of vaping and cannabis, on teaching kids about social media, appropriate use of social media, about privacy and consent. These are life skills at their core, and that's what the emphasis is. We're training our teachers more. We're going to be supporting our parents. We're launching a marketing campaign to speak directly to kids. So we're doing a multitude of actions we didn't in the past, and frankly, in 2019, the request was school boards build a policy. And the truth is, many boards had weak policies. They were ineffective, and so this is why the province is stepping forth with a stronger, more robust system that's actually going to help to change the culture. And I know it's going to be difficult, but we're going to be there to support our teachers. We will back them when they apply and enforce this policy.
Okay, so production in editing will here. I'm almost done editing as of recording, and just to update, the original clip that was supposed to be here was a clip where I said I was still in high school, where I said that I was maybe a week or two away from graduation, but as of recording this, I have graduated. I am now a high school graduate, and I have the final class diploma that will be given out by Stephen Lechier. Thanks for nothing, Steve. Now back to the video. so I can already confirm that vaping in school bathrooms isn't allowed. If they catch you doing it, they'll fine you. At my high school, school administration would cycle through a handful of people to go into bathrooms and kick students out who weren't using them and were just in there goofing around. And despite that, kids were vaping anyways. Stephen Lettier was missing the point, and it's the same problem that smoking in the 1990s had. It is, factually speaking, impossible to fully police. And when it comes to elementary schools, yeah, are you gonna have adults walking into elementary school bathrooms to see if elementary school students are vaping? Yeah, let's see how that works out. Let's see how parents feel about that. And the cell phone thing is somehow even worse. When I was in elementary school, we weren't allowed to play on our 3DS in class. But, you know, sometimes me and a few other students would waste our own time playing Super Smash Bros. Over in the corner. And the teacher didn't even bother because we were wasting our own time, we weren't exactly disrupting others, and my grade 3 teacher understood it wasn't a battle worth fighting. Because, you know, that's derailing the entire lesson to pick a fight with a student. And that's gonna happen with or without whatever electronic device they want to take away being in the classroom. Because, to put it simply, school just isn't for everybody. And doing this does not change that underlying fact. Nor does it make the curriculum more interesting to students, which is what should be the focus of the Ontario government. Oh, but those same teachers who had that basic common sense understanding are going to be forced, whether they like it or not, in public school, come fall, they're going to be forced to police cell phone usage. Yeah, and when you get into high school, yeah, ask that 16-year-old girl who's sending snaps of ceiling tiles to give up her phone and give it to the teacher. Yeah, see how that goes. The fact that Stephen Lettier didn't consider that proves how out of touch and unqualified he was for the job of education minister. And did you know that a disabled high school student ended up dying around the same time due to the fact that his school was so underfunded that his EA, who underlined was supposed to be with him at all times, was not with him? And yes, the fact that the education assistant had to leave in the first place because of the shortage was entirely and is entirely the fault of Doug Ford and Stephen Lettier, due to how underfunded they have left schools. If the Ford government was actually focused on delivering positive changes to school curriculums and giving proper funding to education assistants, teachers, etc., then stuff like this wouldn't happen. That kid dying to the Ford government isn't an issue. Oh, but whether some random high school student is vaping, which is already not allowed in the first place, yeah, that's top priority stuff. That's what we need to be focusing on. And if you're wondering why provincial conservatives time and time again are not getting elected and are losing out to parties like the NDP, this is why. Canadians have had enough of nonsense like this, and Canadians demand better. Issue 3, the worst economic platform. I know a lot of conservatives who have a lot of grace and are very open-minded people. If anyone like that is listening, I have a simple question. In terms of the Conservative Party's economic platform, what does Poilievre plan to do to address the problems we are facing, such as inflation, housing, etc.? From Conservative MPs to Poilievre supporters alike, I have seen no valid explanation as to how the slogan "Axe the Tax" is a viable economic platform, because simply put, it isn't. It's just that, a slogan. It doesn't even begin to explain how that's a viable economic platform, nor is there any explanation as to how he aims to even proceed to axe said tax. I can only assume he keeps the details vague because he believes his supporters are dumb and will believe anything he says. Him being disrespectful aside, to get rid of the carbon tax, he would need to hold a vote in Parliament and get enough votes to actually move on it. If Poilievre has a majority government, he can do it day one. The Conservatives have majority power in the Senate, so yeah, it can be done. The issue lies due to the reasons yet to be brought up. Poilievre and his party are very divisive. He has proposed social and economic ideas that the overwhelming majority of Canadians just do not approve of. So if Poilievre wins in 2025, it will probably be a slimmer majority than what we have now with Trudeau, with likely another orange wave, with Jugmeat as opposition leader. let's remove the Liberals from the picture for a second. The NDP with the Supply and Confidence Agreement has made it very clear that they view Poilievre as significantly worse for the country than Trudeau. Pierre Poilievre has also made quite the effort to ensure Jagmeet Singh is an enemy to him, being unable to put partisan interests aside to get results for Canadians, such as with the Pharmacare Act. Even separate from that, the NDP has made their position on things like the carbon tax very clear. And with the kind of stunts that MPs like Rachel Thomas have pulled, with the disrespect for French culture, the Bloc is especially not on Pierre's side. The NDP, and especially the Bloc, will probably vote against any controversial bill that a potential Poilievre government brings forward, whether out of principle or spite. I mean, let's think about this for a minute. Why would the NDP or Bloc vote in support of something they don't agree with? And moreover, why would they vote in support of something that's proposed by someone who's made it very clear that he has no interest in collaboration, no interest in putting his interests aside for the greater good of the people? Poilievre has even admitted that removing the carbon tax won't be enough and that he plans to lower other taxes as well. But what Poilievre is not saying is what he's going to cut funding for. To lower taxes, you need to cut funding for things, to make the taxes lower. It's not just a slogan, you actually need to cut funding for things to make taxes lower. So the question is, what will he cut funding for? The NDP recently had the Universal Pharmacare Act pass. For those who don't know what it is, in its current infancy, it provides birth control and insulin to Canadians.
We've got a Liberal government, a Prime Minister, and a Health Minister that have sided with the billionaire CEOs of these wealthy corporations instead of Canadians and families that are just trying to buy the medication that they need. So this is a first step towards universal medication coverage for all. We believe no one should have to choose between buying their medication or buying their groceries.
It's meant to set the framework for full universal pharmacare. And despite the fact that it benefits Canadians and in the long term will save millions of people, because currently, have you seen how expensive diabetes medication is? That's stuff you can't live without. This benefits millions. And despite the fact that it benefits millions, the Poilievre Conservatives continue to block it. Given Poilievre's support for privatization, universal healthcare as a whole could be at risk. And before you say that's not a big deal, Americans pay significantly more for incomplete health insurance than Canadians do for single-tier, taxpayer-funded healthcare. That big, powerful paycheck Poilievre likes to talk about won't seem so powerful when you can't afford anything. What about voting against a simple, straightforward framework for a school food program? And I know that the go-to defense with the Poilievre Conservatives was that it was some kind of gotcha bill that didn't actually do anything useful. Nope, you can read through the bill on the parliamentary website as I did. And the bill reads as follows. Whereas too many families in Canada cannot reliably obtain enough nutritious food, whereas the 2018 Health Behavior in School-Aged Children study found that almost 1 in 5 children reported going to school or to bed hungry sometimes, often or always because there was not enough food at home, whereas a healthy diet in childhood is important to maintaining good health and well-being and fostering socioeconomic success, whereas school meal programs of some kind are offered in every province and territory and in many Indigenous communities, but those programs reach only about 21% of school-aged children, whereas domestic and international evidence shows that school meal programs act as social equalizers, whereas Canada is one of the few member countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development without a national school food program in place, and whereas the Parliament of Canada recognizes that education and health are under provincial jurisdiction, and that developing a national school food program for children will require the collaboration of all provinces and territories. Now, therefore, His Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate and the House of Commons of Canada, enacts as follows. The Minister must, in consultation with the Minister of Health, representatives of the provincial governments responsible for health and education, other relevant stakeholders in those fields, and representatives of Indigenous governing bodies, develop a national framework to establish a school food program to ensure that all children in Canada have access to healthy food. The framework must, among other things, A. Set out the criteria for determining whether a food is healthy, taking into account Canada's food guide. B. Indicate which meals and snacks at a minimum must be offered in schools under the program. C. Take into account the different circumstances in which children live, including cultural diversity and the resulting dietary requirements. D. Take into account the rights and priorities of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. E. Provide for measures to avoid stigmatizing pupils who use the program. F. Provide for measures to foster the use of local and sustainable food systems. G. Take into account existing local initiatives and infrastructure. Build on existing school food programs across Canada and use best practices from other jurisdictions. And H. Promote evidence-based healthy food education in schools across Canada. As you heard, this isn't some kind of gotcha bill with stuff tacked onto it. This was a pretty straightforward read. It sets a reasonable timetable for a much-needed public good. So next time you hear Poilievre talk about responsible spending and budgeting, it doesn't mean they're spending less money. It just means that they're cutting anything that provides social good and downloading the costs and existence of these programs onto individuals who use them. Those individuals, by the way, often cannot afford to pay for them privately. Instead of spending money on programs that provide social good, they want to spend it all on cops without reforming the cops. They just want more cops on the street. They want to spend it on vague future military armaments that still haven't fully been delivered 15 years after the fact. In this case, the jets and the icebreakers. And above all else, corporate incentives and bailouts. Physical conservatism is a myth. The money is getting spent either way. It's just with the Conservatives, it's not getting spent on us. Issue 4. Kitchen table politics. Erin O'Toole was a progressive conservative. In his own words, he was a pro-choice ally to the LGBTQ community.
So we are rolling and let's have some fun. Behind me is a mural of We Demand, a 13-page document that called for changes to federal Canadian laws that discriminated against those in the LGBTQ2 community. This national strategy took decades of dedication and persistence for all the demands to be met. Although we've come a long way as a country, there is still more to do. I want you to know that I have been and will continue to be an ally. You have my commitment to be there with you, standing up against homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia. Discrimination and intolerance against the LGBTQ community is unacceptable and has no place in Canada. Today marks the beginning of Pride Month, a time to celebrate the men, women, and non-binary Canadians of the LGBTQ2 community and remember the history that got us here. I served in the military to stand up for the rights of Canadians. I ran for a seat in Parliament to champion those rights, and as Prime Minister, I will work to make Canada more inclusive and safe for the LGBTQ community. Let's celebrate everyone in this amazing and diverse community, and thank you for your outstanding contributions to Canada. Happy Pride.
Now, I'm not saying Erin O'Toole was 100% above criticism here. His reasons for not going to Toronto Pride are something you either agree with or something you don't. He would skip out on Toronto Pride due to them not allowing cops, showcasing a huge amount of ignorance to LGBTQ history and why cops aren't allowed at Pride events. Yes, that definitely does affect queer people who hold the badge, but that's something the community has decided is best. Moreover, the conversion therapy ban, among other things, made Erin O'Toole look like he was either a grifter and sellout or someone who wasn't fully in control of his party. And with that being said, Erin O'Toole's track record was way better than Pierre Poilievre's. So Danielle Smith making policy changes to how Alberta would handle trans youth was definitely a controversial decision. Pierre Poilievre, as the leader of the federal Conservatives, would constantly get questions. You already saw a clip of him claiming that the question contained falsehoods and then completely dodging the question. And regardless of where the question came from, the question was relevant and Poilievre could not reasonably expect someone to take that as an answer. And that's the thing. I think Poilievre knew that. I think Poilievre was just trying to wait to see what his supporters thought before commenting. Because, again, he does not take a principled stance on anything. He slowly ended up revealing his stance on things like puberty blockers. So his initial response was pointless in the first place. Then, of course, when Poilievre was asked the exact same question, but phrased differently, he starts swinning and makes the assertion that transgender women shouldn't be allowed to use the women's washroom.
Female spaces should be exclusively for females, not for biological males.
Yep, the party that wants to bring supposed unity is dividing Canadians with statements like this. And yes, saying something like this is divisive in every sense of the word, not only because you're advocating against someone else's human rights, but the overwhelming majority of Canadians just do not agree with this opinion. I made an episode a while back about this very situation, and I brought up the question of how exactly Pierre would want this enforced, whether women would be carrying papers or if women would be profiled and denied entrance altogether. And it's worth noting that this would lead to non-conforming cisgender women being hate crimed. Yeah, policing which women are and aren't allowed to use the women's washroom would be a mechanical nightmare and would just waste so much time and resources that could be spent on better things. Let's go back to Durham for a second. Jamil Jivani is one of several Conservative MPs who voted against NDP Bill C-273. Bill C-273, for those who don't know, is a NDP bill created by NDP MP Peter Julian with the aim of amending the criminal code. Basically, Peter Julian wants Section 43 of the criminal code to be repealed, which allows spanking and hitting of children under certain criteria. Now, stating that abusing kids is not a parental right should be as controversial as stating that the sky is blue. Oh, but according to Jamil Jivani, no, that's controversial. You're violating people's parental rights by repealing Section 43 of the criminal code, apparently.
Quite clearly that he does not respect or recognize parental rights. In fact, last year in a conversation with Muslim parents, he said that parents who are concerned about their rights and parenting their children are being influenced by, quote, misinformation and disinformation by the American right wing. And these comments could have been made just as easily to Christian parents, Jewish parents, Hindu parents, or Sikh parents. There's a fundamental disrespect that the Prime Minister has for the rights of moms and dads. And it's not just the Liberal Party that has this chronic ideological problem. We have a member of our committee here from the NDP, Mr. Randall Garrison, who also said less than a year ago, there's no such thing as parental rights in Canada. This is not just morally incorrect, it is also factually incorrect.
According to Jamil Jivani, what that NDP MP stated is yucky, because that NDP MP was saying that your kids belong to the state. Except, no, that's not what Randall Garrison was saying. No, it was... Jamil lied about that too, like he does with everything. Taking another quote out of context and spinning it for his narrative. Because if Jamil Jivani had read out Randall Garrison's entire quote, he wouldn't have been able to put that spin on it. Because everything Randall Garrison said was true. And when you take into context what Randall Garrison was talking about, it makes what Jamil stated here even worse.
Clearly, we know, as I said, what works for trans kids is to support and affirm them. And a course of treatment with puberty blockers is part of that successful treatment that allows them to grow and develop into who they really are. And it allows families to have a role in that process. And it allows medical professionals to make the decisions.
If it becomes legislation, what steps should the federal government be taking?
Well, I think that in this case it would regard the Canada Health Act and denying necessary medical treatment under the Canada Health Act. And there are provisions for the federal government to take action when necessary health care is denied to Canadians.
Do you view this as a parental rights issue at all?
Well, I'd like to say, first of all, there's no such thing as parental rights in Canada. There are parental responsibilities. And in Canadian family law, the primary responsibility of parents is to support and affirm their kids. Children have rights in Canada, and these kind of policies restrict the rights that children have in Canada.
Might I reiterate, stating that abusing kids isn't a parental right should not be a controversial stance to hold, nor does it violate anybody's rights. Jamil Jivani, however, does not seem to agree with that sentiment, everything Randall Garrison said in that context alone is right in principle. And considering what the context was, fill in the blanks on what Jamil Javani thinks. It's the implications that he thinks that if your kid is transgender and you don't support their identity, you should get the right to emotionally or even physically abuse them. That's the only takeaway I can gather, considering the situation with Randall Garrison was him responding to people making the assertion that abusing trans kids is a parental right. Yes, there are so many Canadians who unfortunately don't have a good heart and they're just willing to fight this culture war no matter what. But here's the thing, fighting against the rights of trans kids, it may hurt them, but what does it do to make your life better? At the end of the day, bullying kids doesn't put gas in the tank. It doesn't feed your own kids. It doesn't increase your pay. What does anyone have to gain by doing this? And if I'm wrong here, to anyone listening, then please explain to me in good faith, what exactly have I said that you disagree with? What exactly have I said that is incorrect up to this point? It isn't just trans Canadians the Conservatives have focused on either. There was a lot of controversy when the CPC voted on a private member's bill about abortion, and a lot of MPs voted in favor of it, and gave very vocal speeches about how abortion should not be allowed in Canada.
The Honourable Member of Peace River Westlock.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to present a petition today signed by Canadians from across the country. These Canadians are concerned about the nearly 100,000 preborn children who die every year since the Morgentaler decision. Canada is only one of 2 nations in the world that have 0 laws protecting the preborn. They also note that a child's heartbeat begins when the child is 6 weeks old, and they are calling on the Government of Canada and this place to strengthen the protections for the preborn in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Then there was a Conservative MP on the Uncommons podcast who stated that he will try to vote abortion and gay marriage down.
Like, it's not a lonely fight, I suppose.
Yeah, I got you. There are more than I'm anticipating. I'm not in that caucus, and so there are more. It's a stronger voice than I appreciate, maybe. And so, okay, so quick hits. Gay marriage is well behind us. If there's a vote on that, you're voting for gay marriage.
For gay marriage. Well, there's no vote on that. It's purely hypothetical.
Yeah, no. But just quick, it's like the history of social conservatism. So if there's a vote on gay marriage, up or down?
I vote gay marriage down. That's like
okay. If we're voting to overturn Morgentaler, you're voting yay or nay?
Yeah, I don't even think that's a thing. But I would vote to reverse. Well, I wouldn't vote to reverse Morgentaler. I would vote that's. It's not.
I don't know. That's a tough one for a social conservative. It's a hard one. It's a hard one.
introduce. So yeah, no, that one's like, it's not a vote. It will never be a vote. That's. There will be a piece of legislation that comes forward that will answer Morgentaler, and I will.
No, but hang on. Morgentaler struck down certain restrictions, right? So the idea behind Morgentaler was it wasn't a blanket ban, but there were so many different procedural hurdles in the way that effectively restrained rights so much that it was an effective prohibition, and so the court struck it down for a myriad of reasons. But Bertha Wilson she didn't write for any majority because there were concurring opinions in that. But Bertha Wilson has won the day, and when you read her decision today, it would be the majority decision of any court today. And so if you are to reform Morgentaler, you would be reversing Bertha Wilson's view of things, which is a developmental view of the fetus, which is not moment of conception, which is certainly prioritizing a woman's right to choose.
So if they pick a line, introduce a piece of legislation, and they pick a line, I vote for that. I vote for that bill.
And if the line is moment of conception, you vote for that bill.
I'm 100% pro-life, so yeah.
Okay, and
I vote for the-
and on parental rights. So what you follow the story in? I think you introduced a petition on this around New Brunswick, and on I think maybe I read this wrong. I don't want to misquote it, but is there a view of like washroom access? Are we going to redebate that stuff as well around washroom access for trans people? I saw Pierre say something along those lines, and I was like, I must have read that wrong, because that can't possibly be the case.
Well, so I'm supportive of Danielle Smith's position. But again, most of that stuff's like Pierre says, most of that debate is provincial jurisdiction. Right?
Yeah. Although the protection of trans people and gender expression within Canadian human rights legislation is federal. That was a source of consternation for Conservatives, but I didn't get the sense that they wanted to revisit that. But you were yay or nay?
I'm a nay, I guess.
A nay on that one, yeah. Yeah.
Poilievre made the MP in question retract the statement and did a whole show about how same-sex marriage will remain in place under a Poilievre government. But keep in mind, Poilievre voted against same-sex marriage when the government voted on it back in the mid-2000s. And his dad's gay, and he voted against it, so that excuse doesn't work. Lately, Pierre Poilievre has had a fascinating obsession with overstepping his hypothetical federal jurisdiction. He ended up stating that he would use the notwithstanding clause to overturn the bail of Canadians that he personally feels deserve incarceration.
And it will be an automatic fait accompli that multiple murderers will stay in maximum security. And by the way, they will have consecutive, not concurrent sentences. Multiple murderers will only ever come out of jail in a box. And all of my proposals are constitutional, and we will make them constitutional, using whatever tools the Constitution allows me to use to make them constitutional. I think you know exactly what I mean. So they will happen, and they will stay in place.
The one looking to run the country saying this is a huge red flag. We have a legal system and court of law for a reason. The Prime Minister has zero business telling judges what rulings they can and cannot give. That is a slippery slope to authoritarianism. But why stop there? We've seen the provincial Conservatives use the notwithstanding clause in unconstitutional ways to push deeply unpopular policies through, so who's to say the federal ones won't do it? Who's to say that Poilievre won't use the notwithstanding clause to force trans people out of bathrooms and public spaces as a whole, or overturn reproductive rights, or whatever else he feels like that day? Poilievre consistently dodging questions and attacking people asking very real questions about concerns Canadians have means that he certainly has not earned the benefit of the doubt from me. And I know that I am not the only Canadian who feels that way. At the end of the day, Poilievre is not going to get votes from the LGBTQ+ community. None. We've read the poem and we don't trust him. Women will also likely turn away from him. Statistically speaking, the ratio between Poilievre supporters who are men is much larger than women, compared to the Liberals where the number is much more balanced. Concerns about reproductive health care are why, have been why, and because stuff like this is happening, it will continue being the reason why for quite some time. I actually did think that Poilievre had a chance of winning in 2025 when his Conservative Party leadership victory speech happened. Because at the time, it looked like he was not going to be focusing on wedge issues and was only going to focus on conservative economics. All those divisive at best statements and ideas may make it so that way they're not the option for you in the next election. People have the right to not accept what Poilievre presents to them. They have a lot to answer for. And, well, they aren't answering people's questions. So the moral of this story is to always watch what your candidates are saying. So that way you know what you're getting into when you give them your vote.